Welcome to Novara Live. My apologies for the delay. You might have noticed we're having some technical issues over the past few days. That's because we've introduced a new system, which I promise you is going to be more beautiful, more high-tech, more brilliant in the near future. But at the moment, sometimes things have to get a little bit worse before they can get better. It's a lesson I was always taught by my parents. It served me well. I hope you are on board. I'm joined tonight by Barry Malone. How are you doing, Barry?
Hi, Michael. I'm good. Can we tell the viewers that you drafted me in at the last minute? So I wasn't immersed in the news. I was actually out shopping. So if I start talking about like Black Friday deals or something, then you just have yourself to blame.
Well, I really wish you didn't tell the audience that. Now we look like we've got bad tech and we're also bad at organizing our guests. Anyway, we have a brilliant show for you guys lined up. Don't you worry. We will be discussing whether the world has already admitted defeat on climate change. Really interesting interview I've got for you on that. Donald Trump has also, in a really bizarre way, defended Saudi Crown Prince MBS over the Khashoggi killing. He sort of seemed to blame Khashoggi for getting chopped up in a Saudi embassy. And is the whole truth about Jeffrey Epstein finally going to come out? I have a fascinating interview with Murtaza Hussain from Dropsite News about Jeffrey Epstein's connections to Israel. They have a cache of emails, which hasn't really been reported in much of the mainstream press, but Dropsite have done a number of articles about it. I've learned so much. I feel like I finally actually understand what's going on. We've been talking about Epstein on this show for years now, actually, but there's always been more questions than answers. I feel like there are finally a few more answers than questions. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Everyone agrees Keir Starmer's days are numbered. The country already hated him, and apparently so does everyone in his party. But how will he fall? Well, last week, Starmer's own people briefed that it would be Wes Streeting who would attempt to dethrone Sir Keir. But now it seems any challenge to the Prime Minister is, for now, more likely to come from his left. So this morning, The Times reported that the Tribune group of soft-left Labour MPs, nothing to do with the magazine, have secured the backing of the 80 MPs needed to trigger a leadership contest. So this is pretty significant because to challenge Keir Starmer, all you need is 80 MPs to sort of organise themselves behind a challenger. They're saying they've already got the 80 MPs. They haven't, though, said they've already decided on a challenger. So people mentioned in that Tribune group are Lucy Powell, Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy, former Transport Secretary Louise Haigh. Interestingly, not mentioned in that report is Angela Rayner. Reports over the weekend are that Angela Rayner has already been offering cabinet roles to MPs in exchange for support in any leadership contest. So she doesn't feel like the resignation over the tax issues over the House rules her out, which is interesting. Many are, of course, though, still hoping for a replacement to Keir Starmer, who isn't currently in Parliament. This was Clive Lewis today on Politics Live.
You've said that Keir Starmer should resign. You think it's time for him to go?
But I also know that I also have kind of grave concerns about what comes after. And I also understand, look, if someone isn't up to the job, then it's up to the party and that individual to put country before party. And to think about, well, how do we stabilise this situation? And if people don't have faith and confidence in the person that's meant to be coordinating that, then you've got a problem. But at the same time, simply jumping off a cliff edge and saying, well, OK, I had my go and isn't the answer. You need someone with a vision. You need someone that has the confidence of the British public, MPs, that can run a large organisation that has government experience, and those people are few and far between, frankly.
Well, you have suggested Andy. I have suggested Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester.
But obviously, he's not a member of Parliament.
No.
Perhaps he should be.
Perhaps he should be. I really respect Clive Lewis, actually, for going out in the media and saying Keir Starmer should resign, because at the moment, what you've got is pretty much the entire PLP sort of telling journalists, oh, we definitely think he should go. But none of them are saying it publicly. So it just seems a bit more honest to sort of go on the media and say, yeah, of course he should go. Obviously, there are a lot of barriers to Andy Burnham, Clive Lewis's preferred candidate, getting back into Parliament. There has been no obvious seat for him to stand in, or at least there hasn't been until now.
Is Andy Burnham up for this?
You have to ask Andy Burnham.
Have you spoken to him?
I have spoken to Andy Burnham, yeah.
But I'm not sure if he wants to move to Norwich, but would you would you give up your seat for him?
It's a question I've asked myself, and I'd have to obviously consult with my wife as well and family. But you know what? If I'm going to sit here and say, country before party, party before personal ambition, then yes, I have to say yes, don't I?
You give up your seat for Andy Burnham?
I would, yeah.
Wow, okay.
Interesting. I mean, I imagine Andy Burnham, after he's so much about Manchesterism, the king of the North. I don't think he probably will move into Clive Lewis's seat in Norwich, although I suppose it's not entirely impossible. Barry, I mean, we've talked about this before. I think we made a bet. I can't remember what the deadline was. I still think that Keir Starmer might well survive until the elections next May. There's a budget to go through. I'm not sure anyone's in a particular rush to take over the Labour Party in its current state. So presumably there's lots of people who want to spend a bit of time getting their leadership campaign together, for example. But how important do you think this is? I suppose these 80 MPs saying they have enough people to provoke a challenge. Can you imagine that happening in the near future?
I think you're right. I think it could be a bit of a hospital pass to take the leadership of the Labour Party right now. I can't remember what our bet was either. I think I said he could go before May. Look, you said it in the script and we've said it before. He is going. He is not leading Labour into the next election. I think what's interesting in the last couple of weeks is things have opened up in terms of the conversation where we have now several kind of candidates coming into view. And I kind of think that we have to slice this in terms of who can rescue this battered, hapless party that is absolutely tanking in the polls. And obviously they need a new leader. I agree with you. It's good that Clive Lewis comes out and says it when you have the likes of, Lucy Powell claiming that he will lead Labour into the next election. And that she doesn't actually believe that. So I think, we know that they need a change of personnel. We know that they need a change at the top, but they also need a vision. I think me and you have talked about this on the show before also. With Wes Streeting last week, I said that Wes Streeting is going to make no material change to the Labour Party, and they're just not articulating a vision. He goes out and he talks about the NHS, but again, there's not much meat on the bones of what it is that he could offer the party. I think the soft left thing, the Tribune Group, is interesting that they're saying that they have the support. But again, if you look at the people who they have lined up as possible candidates, are they going to make any material change to the Labour Party? Are they going to be able to bring anything different to the public? I don't think so. I think Shabana Mahmood, there are people starting to say that she's coming into view a little bit. Problem with Mahmood is that she is offering this kind of more reform than reform, this cleave to the right, which I fundamentally don't believe is a good electoral strategy when Labour are being attacked from both their right flank and their left flank by Reform and the Greens. So Burnham, I think, is interesting. I agree with you. It's unlikely to see him running in Norwich, right? Because of what you say, his whole shtick is, his Mancherism policy. We saw that, when he did this interview in the New Statesman, I think last month, which people thought was him setting out his stall for the leadership. He talked a lot about Manchester. He talked about Manchesterism. But there were nuggets in there that suggested that he, despite some people criticize him as being a sort of a Blairite in the past, I think there were nuggets in there that suggested that he could be different to the other people who are lining up. He spoke about these dark and divisive forces, by which he meant Reform and the far right. So I think he's suggesting there that if he came into the leadership, that he would go out and attack Reform. He wouldn't try to be like Reform. He would attack them. Then he also spoke about nationalization of utilities and stuff, which again is very, very different to the other contenders. And I actually think that's a really clever electoral strategy when you have the threat from the Greens and the threat from Reform. Go out there, attack Reform, because I don't think trying to be more like Reform is going to work. Try to go on the attack against Reform and then assuage the people on the left he might be losing to the Greens. And so, look, if anyone can save the Labour Party before the next election, and I don't particularly think they're savable, Andy Burnham is probably their best bet right now.
he also benefits from the fact that he's not in the cabinet, so he can say he's got nothing to do with the Keir Starmer failure. And I do. I think you're right. What you need to do as the Labour Party at this point in time is try and be somewhat plausible to people who might be reform curious, but also shore up some of that left-wing vote, because you can't have a decent election result by pissing off everyone who's to the left of Tony Blair and hoping that somehow that's going to win you a majority. So it seems like the most obvious way of having a Labour Party which could win would be having Andy Burnham as leader. And I have to say, I'm really glad that Zach Polanski became the leader of the Greens. But I don't think that his politics is able to win a majority in the country. I'm glad he is leader, because the problem with the Labour Party is that they were saying nothing. The whole political conversation in the entire country was just being dictated by reform. It was an absolute disaster. So Zach Polanski's entry into British politics has been a relief, if anything. I think it's been brilliant. But I can't see them winning majority of the next election. So if you have a strong Greens and a weak Labour Party, I see a big reform majority. So the only thing I can conceivably see to keep reform out would be someone like Andy Burnham leading the Labour Party. He is much more palatable to people on the left. You get, enough people who are willing to do tactical voting to keep out reform to vote for him. Yes, I would like the Greens to get a few more MPs in certain urban seats. But that seems the only way to not have a completely divided left-wing vote and reform coming through the middle. I'm not sure that will be popular with all of our audience. What do you think about that, Barry?
I think it's really depressing, that thought that we should, on the left, that we should vote for Labour in order to keep reform out. And, I hate the fact that Labour thinks that it can rely on that without coming out and offering anything different. It's exactly the way that they ran against the Tories. It was just, we're not the Tories. I said this before, we're the adults in the room. We'll be trustworthy custodians of the economy. And there are people in this country who are just crying out for a different kind of politics. So I'm always a little bit reluctant to say, tactically vote rather than vote for what it is that you believe in. But I agree with you, the entry of Zach Polanski into the top tier of British politics has been really, really positive, because he's managed to shift the conversation. You're absolutely right. Reform, and to some extent the further right, where we're framing the national conversation here, and Labour were letting them do that. And, all of these horrible, nasty policies that we've seen Shabana Mahmood talk about in the last week, they're being introduced because reform has been allowed to frame the conversation. And so it's been great to see Zach Polanski bring other issues to the table. And he was excellent on Newsnight, by the way, criticizing the Labour policies on immigration. And so, look, if Zach Polanski can shift the conversation in such a way that it makes Labour have to address the things that he talks about, such as wealth tax, cost of living, then good. It makes me really uncomfortable that we would have to vote for one party just to keep another party out. But there we are.
I suppose I think if all Labour have to offer is to say we're keeping reform out. So I think Starmer's plan is to offer absolutely nothing whatsoever to people who are, left of centre, and sort of have a period of blackmail where he says sort of, you have to vote for me even if you hate me, because the other option is reform. I think what Andy Burnham could plausibly do is to say, look, even if you don't agree with everything that I'm standing for, I have actually got quite a lot of stuff that you'll like. And by the way, I also like you. The big problem with Keir Starmer is he just looked at such a huge proportion of the country and said, I hate you people, right? And that's not very good for getting about the kind of goodwill. I suppose that there's a difference between tactical voting when what you're doing is saying, I'm voting for you only to keep out reform, and when you're voting for someone who you don't think is necessarily your ideal candidate, who agrees with you on everything, but you're sort of saying, well, that's the kind of person who can bring together enough of the country to win a majority. I suppose where I think with the Greens, and all power to them, They're doing very well at shifting the conversation in the country. I'm not convinced that Zach Polanski is genuinely trying to speak to a majority of the country. I feel like he's competing with Labour for left-wing voters, which is fine. It's good. It's shifting the national conversation in a particular direction. But I don't see how that keeps out reform. So I would prefer a soft left Labour leader who can sort of be a bridge across different parts of the country. And to me, Andy Burnham is pretty much that figure. Angela Rayner potentially as well, but I think she's a lot more tarnished by her relationship to Keir Starmer. Slightly less convincing than Andy Burnham. I think it would be much better if it was an outsider. Lots of people talking about the fact he's not an MP as a weakness. Maybe that's actually a strength if they can get him in there. I'll give you some final thoughts on this before we go to our next story.
Yeah, I don't see why him being an MP should be a weakness. That seems like a bizarre argument to me. And he has been an MP, and he's a senior political figure in this country. What about coalition? I feel like I say this because as an Irish person, we have, this system of proportional representation, which is obviously very different to the first past the post system here, which I don't think is a very good system when it comes to having people in Parliament who represent a broad array of views. And while we've had some issues in Ireland where governments have kind of fallen apart before the end of term, and we've had a bit of instability there, generally I just think it's such a good system in comparison to the first past the post that we see in the UK or that we see in the US, for example, where we're essentially left with this two-party system. So wouldn't it be great if, the Greens could get enough seats that they would end up in some kind of a coalition government with a soft left Labour administration? But maybe that's just me applying sort of like fantasy football to politics here.
Andy Burnham actually also very much in favour of PR. Ideally, we would have PR so everyone could vote for exactly who their favourite candidate was. That's what I'd really like to see. And that's what, when anyone sort of on the media says to Zach Polanski, aren't you just going to split the vote? He says, well, Labour should back proportional representation. And he's exactly right. They should back proportional representation. Donald Trump has always been a fan of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, but at the White House this week, this defense of his ally shocked even his supporters.
He's done a phenomenal job. You're mentioning somebody that was extremely controversial. A lot of people didn't like that gentleman that you're talking about. Whether you like him or didn't like him, things happen, but he knew nothing about it. And we can leave it at that. You don't have to embarrass our guest by asking a question like that.
Now, as a reminder, Jamal Khashoggi was the US-based columnist at the Washington Post who was chopped up by Saudi agents for criticizing Mohammed bin Salman. These were the infamous images of Khashoggi entering the Saudi embassy in Turkey in 2018, where he hoped to collect a divorce certificate. He would never leave that building. This was a huge global story at the time. You'll remember it, but for 2 weeks, the Saudi government denied any knowledge of Khashoggi's fate. Bin Salman even told Bloomberg News that Khashoggi had left the embassy after a few minutes. The Saudis, though, later changed their tune. So as Turkish officials continued to search for the journalist's body, Saudi Arabia said that Khashoggi had been killed during a fight in the consulate after staff attempted to kidnap him. That story changed again days later, with the country admitting the killing was premeditated. And it wasn't long before the CIA concluded that Saudi Crown Prince bin Salman had ordered Khashoggi's assassination. Khashoggi's body was never found, but the Washington Post later pieced together what might have become of it through an audio recording of Khashoggi's last moments in the consulate.
This is a team of operatives from Saudi Arabia that come with a syringe loaded with enough sedative to be lethal. There's a struggle. He maybe tries to resist, and you hear him struggling, trying to hold on to life, hold on to breath, and then that struggle ends. So what happens next in the consulate is it just goes quiet. And it sounds like there is some regrouping going on among this team. The commotion starts again. Then there is a sound of some sort of electronic device, a saw, something. Something is happening that suggests that they are trying to find a way to dispose of Jamal's body. There is this excruciating noise. It's unclear what happens next. It's what happens to Jamal's body is one of the lingering mysteries here.
Barry, I mean, we knew that Donald Trump didn't have much respect for the free press, but this was a Washington Post columnist who was, I mean, we think chopped up and carried out in suitcases from the Saudi embassy. The CIA said that MBS ordered it. Basically, everyone believes MBS ordered it. Trump, when he's asked about it, not only says, let's not talk about this because this is diplomacy, he basically smears Khashoggi, says he's a very controversial guy, like basically he asked for it. And MBS definitely didn't know. Like, it's quite low even for Donald Trump.
It's really low even for him. I completely agree. And look, Donald Trump says the quiet part out loud. We know this about him. And sometimes that's kind of refreshing. Even changing the name of the Department of Defense to the Department of War. Great. That really does describe the US Department of Defense more accurately. And I remember in 2018 when Jamal Khashoggi was killed in, as you say, this incredibly brutal fashion, attacked within moments of walking through the door of the embassy. Trump sort of said, look, we're not going to do anything about it because, Saudi is worth so much money to us. I think he said something like, we're not going to give up $450 billion, which was just another one of those figures that he pulls from the air. But, the sentiment was there. The sentiment was, we're not going to do anything because Saudi is a very close ally. And that is also the case. That would also have been the case under any other president. They just wouldn't have said it out loud. So there is, that realpolitik element to him. But this went so much further than that. He didn't just say, look, MBS didn't know about it, which flies in the face of what the CIA have said, which would be, one thing, but not necessarily surprising. What he did was he justified the execution of a journalist. And, Jamal Khashoggi was not some sort of opposition activist or dissident who masqueraded as a journalist. He'd been the editor-in-chief of Al Madina, which is a very significant newspaper in Saudi. He'd worked as the editor of, I think, Al Watan. He'd worked for Arab News. He'd been a foreign correspondent for one of those newspapers, I think Al Watan, where he'd worked in kind of Afghanistan and Sudan and other places. This was a real journalist who had gone into exile in the US and become quite critical of the Saudi government. And that is why he was killed. And the reporting is all there, not just from the CIA. MBS did indeed order his death. And so to see these two world leaders sitting there and Donald Trump justifying this by saying he was a controversial figure, but also a lot of people didn't like him. Therefore he deserved to be chopped up with a bone saw. I really feel like we're entering some kind of a new era of impunity, where we've kind of never seen world leaders speak this way. And, again, when I talk about realpolitik, I'm sure that there are people in the US State Department or people in the CIA that would have been their attitude privately would have been, what he said, things happen, that is not going to change the nature of our relationship with Saudi Arabia. But I don't think that those people would have gone so far as to even think, well, he had it coming, which is basically what Donald Trump said. So I think it was extraordinary what happened.
Immoral is an understatement, isn't it? Let's look at one of the topics that was discussed at that summit. It was whether the Saudis would join the Abraham Accords with Israel, of course. Let's take a look.
Have you reached an agreement on a U.S.-Saudi defense treaty today? And are you going to bring up the Abraham Accords in your discussion?
I already brought them up.
What did you say?
I think I got a positive response. Would you like to respond?
Yeah, so definitely we believe having a good relation with all Middle Eastern countries is a good thing, and we want to be part of the Abraham Accord, but we want also to be sure that we secure a clear path of two-state solution. And today we have a healthy discussion with Mr. President that we're going to work on that to be sure that we can prepare the right situation as soon as possible to have that.
I think we're, I don't want to use the word commitment, but we've had a very good talk on the Abraham Accords. We talked about one state, two state. We talked about a lot of things in a short period of time. We'll be discussing it further, too. But I think you have a very good feeling toward the Abraham Accords.
Yes, definitely, Mr. President. We want peace for the Israelis. We want peace for the Palestinians. We want them to coexist peacefully in the region. And we will do our best to reach that day.
And the defense agreement, have you reached agreement on that?
We pretty much have.
So, question for the Crown Prince, if I could just finish.
We have reached agreement on that. Okay.
So we talked about one state, two state. Now the one state, two state conversation on the left is generally, should it be a secular state with one person, one vote, where it's not a religious state in any way, or should there be two states where you have a Jewish state and then a Palestinian state? I assume when they talked about one state, two state, it was either the whole thing being Israel with apartheid, or there being an Israel and a Palestine. Barry, the position from the Saudis is that they're interested in signing up to the Abraham Accords if there is some kind of roadmap in place for a two-state solution. How seriously should we take that?
I'm not buying it. I'm not buying that the Saudis are going to sign up to the Abraham Accords anytime soon. I think Mohammed bin Salman played that question off in the Oval Office quite cleverly. When he says that they want a roadmap to a two-state solution, I think they want something more than some kind of a Trump promise. And I think they're sort of kicking the can down the road a little bit. It is still politically quite difficult for the Saudis to sign up to the Abraham Accords, I think. Who's signed up to it so far? I think the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, and then we had Egypt and Jordan already had normalized relationships with Israel. The two big countries who I think Trump really wants to get signed up are Syria and Saudi Arabia. I think a couple of weeks ago, they had kind of trailed that they had one new big country and people thought, wow, could it be Syria? Could it be Saudi? And it turned out to be Kazakhstan. So, no shade on Kazakhstan, but not exactly the headline Trump was looking for. The Saudis want things from the US, right? They want that defense pact. They may want access to US sort of civilian nuclear technology. And the US wants many things from the Saudis. What Trump mostly wants is money. He wants to be able to trumpet investments. Trump wants to trumpet investments. But, also we should remember that his family has massive investments in Saudi. And so I think, he's speaking in public, trying to put a little bit of public pressure to show people that he's working on it. But I reckon that even behind the scenes, Trump knows that is not going to happen within the next 5 minutes. But I think that MBS is clever enough to dangle the possibility for some leverage with the US. But I will be very, very surprised if this happens quickly. Just two things in terms of the pressure I mentioned and the political kind of risk for the Saudis. Although the space for freedom of expression is still very, very slim in Saudi Arabia, Saudi society is very, very, very pro-Palestine. And I don't think that MBS wants to irritate the Saudi population in that way. And then also, if Saudi Arabia was to sign up to the Abraham Accords, then, its number one kind of regional foe, Iran, will be able to accuse it of betrayal. And Turkey would probably do the same thing. So I just don't see it happening anytime soon. I don't think it makes sense for the Saudis. And I don't think that the US has enough clout right now to bounce them into it.
Sort of a fairly different topic, but sort of Saudi related, just because it keeps appearing on my news feed. It's sort of like TikTok videos of people at like music festivals in Saudi Arabia with men and women and people not covered, and people sort of saying how much Saudi Arabia has changed under MBS. Now, obviously, he's not someone who cares about human rights. He's someone who who ordered the murder of a journalist. Sorry. Is Saudi Arabia liberalizing though? Sort of, if you were a Saudi person, is it a better place to live than it was before MBS came to power? What's your understanding of that?
I don't know. Sure, there has been a slight liberalization when it comes to the things that you're talking about. And we know that Saudi is trying to diversify its economy a little bit, right? And they're opening up to international investment. They want foreigners to come. They want foreigners to visit. We've also seen the sports washing, where they're moving into football. I'm a massive boxing fan, and they've essentially taken over the sport of boxing entirely. So I think that some of these moves are an attempt to attract foreign investment, to soften the image a little bit in order to do that. But the space for freedom of expression and the space for any criticism of the government is still not there at all. So, yeah, maybe some social reforms, but reforms around human rights or freedom of expression or anything like that? No, not at all. And actually, I think that, what we've seen MBS is willing to do in order to shut down dissent does not indicate that, that the space for political expression is going to open up anytime soon.
We are in week 2 of COP30. That's the 30th International Climate Conference to try and avoid climate catastrophe. This time is different, though. Ever since the Paris Agreement in 2015, these summits have been used as a platform to warn of the dangers of overshooting a limit of 1.5 degrees of warming compared to pre-industrial levels. And each year, the slogans have become more desperate. In 2021, UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres warned that tougher action would be needed to keep 1.5 degrees alive. At the 2023 COP, he said this.
Our planet is minutes to midnight for the 1.5 degree limit.
But if in 2023 we were at 1 minute to midnight, the clock has now struck 12.
The truth is that we have failed to avoid an overshooting above 1.5 degrees in the next few years.
That was the message from Antonio Guterres on the eve of COP30, meaning this is the first climate summit which has opened with a UN General Secretary admitting defeat. Right? We're not going to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So how do we adjust to a world where climate change isn't a future risk that can be avoided, but rather is something we are already dealing with in the here and now? And does the politics of climate change need to radically shift to deal with the reality of 1.5 degrees warming? And well, those are questions posed in a new podcast series from Planet B and the Strategic Climate Risks Initiative called Overshoot. It's hosted by climate policy expert Laurie Laybourn, who I spoke to earlier today.
I think the starting place is would change the story, basically. We have stories that are often about winning or losing. They're binary stories. And they're not working out anymore. They don't make sense, because when it's clear that we have not stayed below 1.5, which was often framed as a moment that we had to aspire to not hit, to save the world, then the implication is that the world is lost, we have lost. What does that mean? And a lot of people who work in the climate world, I think, are struggling with that right now, that the binary story of win-lose has started to break down because it's clear we didn't win. So a starting point is to have different stories, ones that aren't based on a either or win-lose construction, and instead have stories that are more suitable for this current moment. And in the podcast, our way of thinking of that was to use the analogy of a ship in the storm. There's a binary story before you hit the storm, you're sailing towards it, of we've got to not go in that storm, and there's a win-lose outcome. And if you didn't manage to do that and you end up in the storm itself, the story has to shift to something that's less either or, that's more about navigating, that's more about working your way through that emergency situation that you have ended up in. And I think that's a critical starting point now when it comes to this climate and ecological emergency, is we've got to have these stories that are much more about navigating what is now coming, and not about whether we've won or lost.
In the analogy, we haven't managed to avoid it. What does that, I suppose, how does that inform how we should think about climate? What does one do when they're in the climate storm as opposed to trying to avoid it?
To stretch this analogy as far as we could plausibly and politely take it. We went and spoke to some champion sailors, which was a very interesting experience. And through the discussions we had with them, we identified a bunch of capabilities that I think now are particularly important for what comes next, right? One of them, unsurprisingly, was storytelling. If you're a sailor and you end up in a storm, you've got to have a story to make sense of the much harder condition you're now in and what you need to do to stay the course. Another one is that you need to become much more resilient to be able to handle the things that are happening in the literal and figurative case of the climate storm for us, right? So societies are extremely vulnerable all over the world. Even wealthy countries like Britain are very vulnerable. And we still don't really have a politics of, I would say, outrage at how governments have failed to adapt. Well, we didn't until recent events where places around the world, in Europe, have been hit by extreme climate-driven shocks, and the failure to adapt has been brutally, at times, tragically exposed. And that has led to outrage and a type of politics, but it's been the exact opposite of the politics that we might hope for and that we need. In the case of the Valencia region, which was hit by extraordinary floods just over a year ago, that climate-driven disaster ended up boosting the prospects of climate-denying politicians who used contorted arguments about how the floods were made worse because of environmentalism messing around with rivers and so on. None of that was true, but what it does is show that there's a particular risk that's starting to emerge now, one that we call derailment risk, which is that the consequences of climate change could create all sorts of crazy conditions that actually frustrate our ability to act. That's the equivalent of being a sailor in a storm and being so busy handling the impacts of the storm on the boat that you fail to be able to navigate. So that's a particular strategic challenge that is now becoming more serious, that will only get more serious, that can be dealt with, but is not being thought about or spoken about enough among governments, other key institutions who play a crucial role in dealing with climate change.
So this idea of derailment risk, you're sort of on track to doing something about climate change, but then an environmental disaster comes along and that boosts opposition to climate action. It's a somewhat sort of confusing mechanism there. What's going on? What is this argument that climate disasters can cause politics to move in an even more anti-climate direction?
Yeah, it seems paradoxical. And it basically is a situation in which there is so much dislocation and anger coming in the wake of disasters that populations, probably weren't even told were possible now, because this thing is playing out much harder and sooner than we expected. In that anger, people want someone to blame. And they look around and they look at the people in charge who they already have very low levels of trust in. And they see that effectively those people fail to keep them safe. And then there are other politicians over here saying, yeah, well, we have also been warning you not to trust these people. We also think that they're feckless. They then deploy a false argument that is often bolstered by misinformation that makes that paradoxical claim. So in Valencia, the argument was that the climate fanatics of the European Union and the central government in Spain are more interested in protecting river ecosystems and to do that by demolishing dams, that it led to a massive increase in the river flow that then caused the disaster, right? There's a bunch of local context there. There's a whole set of politics in Spain about dams that go back to the Franco era, right? None of that was true, but it seemed to make sense when you don't trust the people in charge, when they look feckless, and in the case of Valencia, when they did mess up the emergency response. Trump used a similar argument, actually, after the LA wildfires. He said, this wasn't to do with climate change. The reason why this was a disaster was because of feckless Democrats who were more interested in protecting a niche fish species called smelt and stopped the extraction of water from rivers, which meant that there was no water in the fire hydrants to then put out the fires, right? So what's happening there basically is these climate delaying or denying politicians are better at exploiting the political opportunities that come in the wake of disasters often than pro-climate politicians. And there are going to be more climate disasters. So there's going to be more opportunities for this to happen in the future.
So your argument is that sort of better preparations need to be made by politicians in favour of climate action to avoid such a thing. And I suppose in general, is the argument that sort of chaos is not very good for climate policy, and that sort of stability is probably preferable.
I don't think climate politics, like pro-climate politics, is ready to deal with the chaos. I think that's more the thing, because there are huge opportunities in chaos, right? If you look back through history, some of the most extraordinary advances for, progressive causes have come in the wake of disasters, right? In the UK context, on the left, we often valorize the extraordinary moment of national renewal that occurred in the wake of the Second World War, right? And it was the crisis conditions of the Second World War, which smashed to pieces existing power balances and, had a massive impact on reducing inequality and so on and so on and so on, that enabled that moment of rejuvenation. At the moment, I don't think that some segments of climate politics are wanting to even face up to the fact that chaotic times are here and will only become more severe, and to develop a politics of being able to navigate through that chaos and, exploit the political opportunities for driving the case forward. At the moment, it looks like actually that those who are more prepared to exploit crisis moments for their own political gain are those who want to actually hold us back on climate change. And that creates a doom loop, right? Because then there's less climate action, which means climate change will get worse, which means there will be more chaos and more opportunities to exploit that to derail climate action, and you get stuck in a vicious cycle. We need a type of politics now that's very alive to, wants to admit the existence of that chaos in the first instance, and then have strategies to be able to navigate through it and ensure that we have these succession of turning point moments that can exploit the opportunities born by crisis.
Is the whole truth finally going to come out about Jeffrey Epstein? Congress has finally approved a bill demanding the release of the Epstein files, which follows a lengthy campaign by Epstein's victims. Now, they include Jess Michaels, who spoke on Capitol Hill.
And for too long, truth has been buried, survivors have been silenced, and powerful people have been protected. And today we stand in a moment that will decide whether our government still belongs to the American people or to those who prey on them.
That was Jess Michaels speaking outside Congress when that vote was taking place. Like previous presidents, Donald Trump has long resisted the release of files relating to Epstein. But even before this vote by Congress, emails were already emerging by other means. So last week, the Democrats released 3 emails linking Trump to Epstein, including 2 where Epstein claimed Trump knew about the girls he and Ghislaine Maxwell were trafficking, even spending some time with some of them. Those emails were part of a larger release of documents involving over 23,000 pages and connecting Epstein to high-profile figures like Bill Clinton-era Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, journalist Michael Wolff, and left-wing academic Noam Chomsky. Hours after that release, a petition amongst lawmakers to release the files in full gained enough signatures to force a vote in Congress. It was that petition that forced Trump's hand in the vote that we started this segment with. By Monday, Trump had conceded defeat.
They can do whatever they want. We'll give them everything. Sure, I would. Let the Senate look at it. Let anybody look at it. But don't talk about it too much, because honestly, I don't want to take it away from us. It's really a Democrat problem. The Democrats were Epstein's friends, all of them. And it's a hoax. The whole thing is a hoax. And I don't want to take it away from really the greatness of what the Republican Party has accomplished over the last period of time.
I mean, it's obviously an incredibly serious topic, as will become apparent in the interview that I'm about to show you. But as sort of Trumpisms go, to campaign for ages for the files not to be released because you know that your name is in them, and then your hand to be completely forced because members of your party and the opposition party voted for the files to be released, and then to say, okay, fine, release them, just don't talk about them, please. It's very Trumpian. The petition to force a vote on the release of the files required support from both Democrats and Republicans. And 3 of the most vociferous advocates for transparency were 3 women MAGA lawmakers and former Trump loyalists who continually defied the president who wanted them to stop pushing for the release of the files. Trump is reported to have leaned in heavily on former allies Lauren Boebert and Nancy Mace to remove their signatures from the petition to force a vote. They refused. And perhaps the most determined of all of those pushing for the release of the Epstein files was Marjorie Taylor Greene, who launched a major media tour to denounce the president for keeping the files locked away. Here's what she had to say after yesterday's vote.
I was called a traitor by a man that I fought for 6 years for. And I gave him my loyalty for free. I won my first election without his endorsement, beating 8 men in a primary. And I've never owed him anything, but I fought for him for the policies and for America first. And he called me a traitor for standing with these women and refusing to take my name off the discharge petition. Let me tell you what a traitor is. A traitor is an American that serves foreign countries and themselves. A patriot is an American that serves the United States of America and Americans like the women standing behind me.
Now, what's interesting about that clip is that Taylor Greene isn't talking about the president trying to protect himself or other powerful people. She's accusing him of serving foreign countries. In another interview, Taylor Greene was even more clear about which country she meant.
You questioned who and what country is putting so much pressure on Trump to keep the Epstein files hidden. And you included a picture about donations from pro-Israel lobbying group AIPAC. What are you trying to say there?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's the question that many Americans are asking, especially when we saw information recently come out in these emails that the Oversight Committee that I serve on has released. And we saw Jeffrey Epstein with ties to Ehud Barak. We saw him making business deals with them, also business deals that involved the Israeli government, and seems to have led into their intel agencies. And I think the right question is to ask is, was Jeffrey Epstein working for Israel?
I just want to be clear. Are you saying Israel is pushing the president of the United States to cover up the Epstein files? And what evidence do you have that that is the case? I simply just asked out loud, is there a foreign government? It could be any foreign government, but is a foreign government pushing to keep this covered up? Because people just don't understand the big fight against. Well, you had AIPAC up there. It was pretty clear which government you were talking about.
That I'm questioning that government in particular and questioning any other foreign government.
Whether or not there is a foreign government pushing to keep these files a secret, it is certainly the case that Epstein had very close relationships with Israeli officials, very senior ones, Israeli politicians, and that this is an under-discussed part of this story, especially in the mainstream media. They've talked a lot about Epstein and Trump, Epstein and various sort of American public figures and celebrities, but they have been much less interested in what is potentially a more interesting story, which is sort of the relationship between Epstein and geopolitics, foreign governments, right? That should be very interesting. Lots of people don't really want to talk about it. Some people, though, do. Two journalists who have been very interested in Epstein's relationship with Israel are at Dropsite News. They're Murtaza Hussain and Ryan Grimm. They've been digging into the sex offenders' links with the country via Epstein's relationship with former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Hussain and Grimm have written about Epstein's involvement in brokering an Israeli security agreement with Mongolia. They've exposed how the billionaire helped establish a back channel between Russia and Israel during the Syrian civil war. They've also detailed how an Israeli spy was put up in Epstein's Manhattan apartment for weeks at a time. And they've even uncovered Epstein's discussions on behalf of Israel with the Swiss Rothschild Bank over funding for the country's cyber weapons industry. So these are all, very close relationships, very, very interesting. No one else really reporting on them. Well, earlier today, I was joined by Murtaza Hussain. I began by asking him to explain the email leak that provided the source for his and Ryan Grimm's work.
So our stories, of which we published 5 so far, are based on 2 major sources. First are the House Oversight Committee's in the U.S. Disclosures on Epstein's contacts and schedules in the last few years of his life. But also, a lot of them are based on a separate trove of hacked emails from former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Barak was known to be a close associate of Epstein. And these emails, which mostly are clustered between 2012 and 2016, show Barak and Epstein working together on a very broad range of projects around the world, aimed at accomplishing multiple goals, first and foremost, achieving Israeli security and political objectives, but also helping generate revenue for Barak's own consulting business as he transitioned at that time out of a role as Israel's defense minister. So these are the major source of information, but we keep getting more information as time goes on because the U.S. House Committee on Epstein is disclosing more emails periodically. And while they are redacting information and they're not giving the full picture, so to speak, it allows us to fill in the blanks from other sources of information we have. So it's an ongoing series we've been working on for the few months, and we plan to continue for many months to come.
And so talk about the relationship between Ehud Barak and Jeffrey Epstein, because it seems like they were quite close friends. Ehud Barak leaves office, so he was prime minister, then he's defense secretary, he's defense minister, leaves government. And like many politicians, he wants a new source of revenue, and then he sets himself up as, to some degree, I suppose, a consultant. Also, he's got his own sort of security startups. He's trying to make money, basically, by brokering agreements between Israeli defense firms and foreign governments. And then he uses Jeffrey Epstein as a bit of a fixer, someone to bounce ideas off, and also to introduce him to other foreign officials. So if you could sort of talk me through that, maybe with one of the main examples that you use.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating relationship that they have. It was very close. It was a very intimate relationship that Barak and Epstein had. In a couple emails, Epstein refers to Barak as somebody, one of the only people in the world he can talk to. He expresses this great personal warmth. They meet very often. Barak actually stays in Epstein's house for long stretches of a time. Even when Epstein's not there, he's ostensibly using it as a base to do business and plan meetings in New York while Epstein's out of town. But, effectively, I think what their relationship was, in large part, was while, it's very common in the US and also in Europe and elsewhere that powerful public figures, once they leave public life, they will use to leverage their connections they gained in office to make a lot of money, to become very powerful, and then to generate revenue for themselves and so forth. So it looks like Epstein was somebody who Barak relied upon to help him do that once he left official public life in Israel. He was the defense minister until 2013. He had ties with Epstein before that, and then beyond that as well. And he was very eager, and he expressed this in his emails, to generate personal wealth now that he was technically a private citizen. So what Epstein did for Barak, and presumably for others too, is that he was somebody who had a tremendous amount of contacts around the world, far more contacts than any one person could have organically, in my opinion, with powerful government figures, business magnates, and so forth. And he would help connect Barak with these people. And, as a fixer, portraying Barak as like a consultant who could provide help with security issues, with tech issues, with the surveillance issues that countries were having. And the specific mechanism by which Barak made himself useful to these states and individuals with Epstein's help was proposing the services of tech firms in Israel which were linked to Israeli intelligence. So we've done a couple stories about this so far, and we have more to come. Effectively, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Mongolia, in Nigeria, and other countries, Epstein helped introduce Barak to top officials who needed help with issues in their country, various different issues, usually related to security. And then Barak would use that introduction as a means of introducing these Israeli intelligence-linked firms, which would then help build, so to speak, a surveillance state in these places, or help them build the rudiments of a surveillance state, at least in these places. And then after these introductions were made, and after these conversations were had, and the private firms started working, with quasi-private, I would say, they weren't really private. A few years later, the Israeli government would often come and sign formal security agreements with those countries officially. But at the inception of all these agreements was Epstein. Epstein was a person who used his contacts to conduct back-channel diplomacy. And, we've talked a bit about Africa and Central Asia and places he had links. He had links all over the world. He had the US, Middle East, Europe, Russia. He was helping set up back-channel diplomacy between Barak and Putin to convey messages from the Israeli security establishment over the Syria war. So he was someone very, very involved, embedded in these networks of powerful people around the world. And, one of the places he was most embedded, you could say, was Israel.
And I suppose what's surprising or curious, or I still haven't quite got my head around, is is why Epstein was better connected than all these people. Because, I could see, but if I was trying to sell arms to Mongolia, I'd need someone to hook me up with someone from the Mongolian security establishment. But if you're Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel, then the defense secretary of Israel, can you not get that email address directly? How was it that Epstein was better connected than a prime minister of Israel? And I suppose this links back to something you mentioned earlier. You said that his connections are too broad to have developed organically. What do you mean by that?
So I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head with this question of one of the most vexing aspects of the whole Epstein saga, because, it's very clear that he had more influence and power than many powerful government officials around the world. If you look at these emails between himself and Barak, at this time when 2012, 2013, when Barak was still one of the most powerful, influential people in the Israeli security establishment and political establishment, there's a clear power dynamic in those emails. It was not that Epstein was seeking out Barak's attention or trying to get a hold of Barak per se. It was really inverted. Barak was somebody who was eager for Epstein's attention, eager to work with Epstein, anxious to be in his good books and so forth. So, it certainly wasn't like Epstein was working for Mossad or something like that. He was far more powerful than that. He was somebody who people who were working for Israeli intelligence, like Barak, continued to do throughout his career and throughout his life. They were looking for Epstein's help. So Epstein was somebody who had leverage over all these people. He was seen as someone more powerful than them. If I were to speculate, very conservatively, he was somebody who clearly had the ability to make individuals very wealthy if they were connected to him, if they were in his good books. So that could give him a sense of leverage over them. Also, this is not noted in his emails, and it's not noted in his official schedules, but we know that he was heavily involved in global sex trafficking of minors to other elites. So one can only imagine what sort of leverage that may have also afforded him. It's a fascinating thing because all of our reporting, it's nothing to do with that aspect of his life. And yet that's the aspect for which he's most notorious, in fact. I don't know exactly who was Epstein's answerable to? How did he become this influential? These are questions which I hope we will get to the bottom of at some point. But it's clear from looking at these communications that all these very powerful people who we would consider the most powerful people in the world, in some way were beholden to Epstein, who officially was merely a private citizen.
Let's talk about the money and the sex trafficking issue sort of in turn. So let's start with the money. You said Epstein had the ability to make people rich or help them accrue wealth. We're often told he's a financier. I think something that's often underdeveloped in writing about this is, what is a financier? I know what a banker is. I know what someone who works at a bank does. But a private financier who sort of helps people move money and accrue money, what was Epstein's job?
Well, Epstein did work in investment banking in New York in the 80s, briefly. And then he got in trouble. He was fired for some scandal with insider trading and so forth. But I think what he really was a money launderer. He was a very talented, you could say, and influential money launderer. We were going to try to, there's a lot of public information about this, but he had connections to people who were involved in the Iran-Contra and so forth, and other episodes, very important episodes in U.S. political history in the last few decades. Epstein seemed to be somewhere near the core of many of them. So, money laundering is something which is very useful to intelligence agencies. And if you look at Iran-Contra, for instance, a lot of how that was facilitated was by, through the need of masking the origins of funds which could not be officially allocated by state budgets, because that would open them up to public scrutiny, which people in power and people in the security establishment did not want. So money laundering, if you're able to do it on a large scale, it's very useful to people who would like to conduct cloak and dagger political operations and military operations off the books. So he was somebody who seemed to be heavily involved in that. He had certainly very extensive connections to people who were known to be involved in that. And I think that, the word financier, as you sort of alluded to, is a bit of a euphemism. Certainly he was someone who worked with money, but, I think he's not like, the bank manager. That certainly was not the role he was playing. And, how he made people money, like if we look at his relationship with Barack, I think it offers a very interesting sort of case study. Barack was leaving public life. He wanted to make a lot of money. He was clearly, from his messages, extremely enthusiastic and extremely eager to make money immediately. And what Epstein would do is he'd help set meetings up with him. He'd give him ideas for how he can leverage his experience and contacts inside the Israeli security establishment to channel into a revenue stream. He would give him ideas of people around the world, including the US and Europe, who he could meet and talk to about these things, who may be able to give him advice or guide him in the right direction. And he would set up meetings with these people and also with private banks who would be able to also contribute to these efforts to create investment funds for firms that Barack would rally together to accomplish a certain goal. And all this would accomplish multiple goals at once. It would make money for Barack. It would help, and it would help channel money into the Israeli security establishment, into private Israeli firms linked to the intelligence establishment. And then it also would help Israel build ties with foreign countries upon the basis of those non-political, non-explicitly political connections that Epstein and Barack helped to create. So he was doing all that, and he was a fixer, he was a rainmaker, he was all these terms one could use. I think none of them fully grasped the full scope of what he was involved in and who he was.
That was the first part of my interview with Murtaza Hussain. We'll be releasing the rest of it on the channel tomorrow. You don't want to miss it. For now, my thanks to Barry Malone and to you for watching. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Good night.